Hi, this is Rick McGill, and in this video I'm going to offer you a series of tips that apply regardless of the cheese that you are making. The most important ingredient in making your cheese is your milk, so the first series of tips I'm offering are on finding and using the right milk. Raw milk is always the best ingredient if you can find it. An easy way to find raw milk in your area is go to realmilk.com and then select your state, and they will direct you to suppliers of raw milk. However, the difficulty with raw milk is in finding it and also in the cost. It can cost anywhere from $10 to $12 a gallon. If you're going to use pasteurized milk, see if you can find a source of milk that is pasteurized at the minimum levels. This is either at 145 degrees for 30 minutes or 162 degrees for 15 seconds. Minimally pasteurized milk produces results very similar to raw milk. Personally, I use the milk from Southern Swiss Dairy. I obtain it through Silo, an online farmers market in Bluffton and Beaufort. If you want to find a source of good milk, go to cheesemaking.com, and there with their milk finder, they can direct you to a good source of milk in your area. If you're using a pasteurized milk and you're having trouble getting the curd to form or to hold up through the recipe, you may need to add calcium chloride in the process. Calcium chloride is added at the beginning and prior to any rennet or culture being added to your milk. Calcium chloride will allow the milk to bond better and curd to form. However, you should never use calcium chloride if you are making mozzarella, because an important part of mozzarella is stretching the curd, and if calcium chloride is added to the milk, the curd will not stretch. My final tip on milk is avoid ultra-pasteurized milks. These have been pasteurized at such a high temperature, the curd will not form properly, and your batch of cheese will likely not succeed. Ultra-pasteurized milks have to be labeled as UP. However, finding that label can be somewhat problematic. I typically find most organic milks and most optional forms of milk, like lactose-free milks, are ultra-pasteurized. So always check and avoid at all costs. Remember, use rennet, not junket tablets, for making cheese. Rennet is derived from the stomach of animals. It comes in liquid or tablet form. Liquid is good for those who make a lot of cheese. Tablets are great because they store in the freezer for at least 2 years. Remember, with rennet, you always dilute it in filtered water. The ratio I like to use is for every half teaspoon of liquid rennet, I like to dilute it in about 1/4 cup of filtered water. Prior to adding your rennet, it's always good to get into the habit of doing a quick stir of your milk. Let's make sure everything is mixed up. And then before you add the rennet, you're going to want to quiet the milk and have it as still as possible prior to adding the rennet. When you add the rennet, pour it over a slotted spoon to disperse it, and then slowly stir the rennet and the milk mixture from top to bottom for no more than 30 seconds to get the rennet as thoroughly mixed through the milk as possible. Once you are done stirring your rennet into your mixture, allow the milk to stay covered and to sit quietly in an area where it will not be disturbed for the length as recommended by your recipe. Okay, many of the recipes you're going to work on involve working with the curd. And a common thing is cutting the curd. But when is it time to cut? This was something I struggled with a lot when I started to make cheese. And so I'm going to give you a couple of tips in terms of when you should be cutting the curd. The first tip is the easiest. You should never cut the curd earlier than it calls for in the recipe. So if the recipe says 2 hours, wait 2 hours before you even think about trying the curd and see if it's ready to cut. If the recipe gives you a range, say 1 to 4 hours, always select the longest length in the range, for example 4 hours, and only at that point begin looking at the curd to see if it should be cut. Another tip in knowing when it might be time to cut the curd is take a look at the curd. If a curd is ready to be cut, it typically has begun to separate from the vessel where you're having it ripen, and also it will slightly submerge, so there will be a layer of whey over the curd. If your curd doesn't look like this, don't even begin trying to poke it or look for a clean break or any of the other things they suggest in the recipes. Finally, you're going to see a lot of examples of looking for a clean break. Did the clean break happen? Frankly, I think those are all very confusing. What you can do is just make a very slight cut in the curd, and if that cut takes, for example, you see it right now, the cut is happened on this, and the way, or the curd does not move to reform or repair the cut, then you know the curd is ready to cut. When you actually cut the curd, you do it in 2 steps. The first step is a grid cut, where you're taking the large curd block and you're cutting it into 1-inch squares. And you do it like this. Just put your knife down, slice along, and you do these parallel slices that are about 1 inch apart. And you'll see the curd moves a little bit as you do this. And then once you've cut it that way, then you just cut it at a right angle, making sure your knife goes all the way down to the bottom. And you can see the squares happening right now. Once you do this, you cover your curd for 5 minutes before you do anything else. You don't cut it any smaller than this at the first pass. You leave it like this and wait 5 minutes. Okay, after the curd is set for 5 minutes, that's when you do any subsequent cuts. And all you do for that is you're just angling in the curds to cut a little bit more. Start from the center and you work your way out to just cut the curds to be slightly smaller. And this gives you a little bit more surface area on the curd to the whey, and that's how the whey basically begins to leave the curd. And finally, when your recipe tells you to stir the curd, it's important to know that stirring means pushing the curd. So all you do if you need to stir the curd is put your spoon into the curd mix and gently push it to get the curd rotating through the whey. This is what stirring means. Don't do a lot of lifting, really just push it along, and this helps the curd and the whey separate even further. With citric acid, there are 2 important things. I like to incorporate it into warmed milk at 86 degrees. But when you do incorporate it, really stir it briskly to make sure you work it throughout the milk. After it's incorporated, you will need to continue to stir the milk throughout the warming process to ensure the citric acid remains appropriately mixed. When adding a powdered culture to your milk, sprinkle it gently over the top of your milk, and then let it sit for 2 minutes before you stir it into the milk. This will allow it to incorporate smoothly, and it will avoid lumps or wads of the culture that do not dissolve in the milk. Calcium chloride may be an important additive if you're using pasteurized milk. This solution actually helps your milk form curd once rennet is added. However, you should never use it if you're making mozzarella. You add calcium chloride to the milk at the beginning of the process, before adding any rennet or any culture. Typically, you dilute it 1/4 teaspoon into 1/4 cup of water. If you're going to add salt to your cheese, it's critical to use cheese salt. This incorporates better than any type of salt and can give you the desired result that you're seeking. Lipase is a flavor additive. I sometimes will use it when making a quick mozzarella. If you're going to use lipase, you need to be certain that you mix it 30 minutes before you incorporate it into your milk, and you need to add it prior to adding the rennet. When flavoring cheese, it's best to use dry herbs to avoid the bacteria that can develop from using fresh herbs. A neat trick is to find a dip mix that you like and use that to flavor your cheese. It's important that the dip mix does not contain salt. I've tried and used Sherry's Gourmet Dips and found that they work exceptionally well for the cheeses that I make. However, many of the dip mixes you can buy in your local store will work as well. So give that a try and see what you can come up with as you try to flavor your cheese and get greater variety in the cheeses you're making. And finally, if you're going to be a home cheese maker, you have to develop a sense of humor. You're going to have batches that fail. Even if you get milk from one supplier, that milk will change over time as the feed or the pastures that are used for the cows change. A lot of the fun in making cheese is not only making great cheese that you can consume, but is also figuring out the problems or the issues that you encounter. So get ready to start a journey where not only do you have a chance of making some spectacular cheese you can share with your family and friends, but where you can also become a problem solver and take great pride in the solutions you develop and the cheese you make.